Someone just spent $360,000 on the Nintendo PlayStation. Now, if you don't know what that is, the Nintendo PlayStation was Nintendo and Sony's hybrid console that they made in 1992. They announced it at CES, and the day after, Nintendo backed out, which forced Sony to either stop making a video game console or make their own, which came out with the PlayStation 1. The original name for it was the Nintendo PlayStation Super NES CD-ROM. So Heritage Auctions just sold the Nintendo PlayStation for $360,000. I don't know if you can imagine that number, but that's more than people make in 5 years, in 10 years. As someone in the video game collecting community, I can't believe something like the Nintendo PlayStation, first off, even exists. To see Nintendo and Sony try to make a console together is pretty mind-blowing. Two completely different companies coming together in 1992 to come up with a system that not only takes cartridges, but takes CDs as well. Now, there were no games that were made for the Nintendo PlayStation, but what it could do is play music files, and the little LCD screen on top would have shown you what song was playing and what you could do, fast forward, rewind, stop, all that. But you could totally play NES and Super NES games on there. And Heritage did, in fact, play Mortal Kombat on this console and said, yes, this works. We've done it, we've tried it, we've played it, it actually works. So if you want a super expensive console that's worth an insane amount of money just to play Mortal Kombat on, go for it. The back of the console had AV out, S-Video, and the Super Nintendo's multi-out ports, but it also had a port that was just called Next, and no one really knows what that port did. Next could have been Sony and Nintendo's own output system, which could have gone to maybe like a Sony TV that's only for that, where it wouldn't have gone to any other hardware, but it would only be for the Nintendo PlayStation 2, let's say a Sony TV or its own proprietary hardware. What's interesting is actually looking at the console itself. There's a lot of similarities to what the PlayStation 1 was. It has the eject, reset buttons, those large circle buttons on top, but it also has a disc system. And seeing that on a Nintendo console pre-2000s is weird. Like, you see the GameCube and those were the tiny discs, but to see full-size discs in the 90s for a Nintendo console was odd. You only saw that on the PlayStation, and that was, I think, something that could have been amazing. When we saw the Famicom disc system, and that was like floppy disks, but seeing a full-size CD going into something that Nintendo made, that was never a thing in the 90s. So seeing Sony come in with that and Nintendo almost backing it, to me, that shows a different sign that Nintendo was really trying to go for CDs, but kept cartridges. I don't know if there was just a disagreement on that or on other things where Sony wanted to take more control. Clearly, we saw Nintendo was interested in it. They didn't go for it until the GameCube, but it was something back then. The coolest thing to me is seeing that controller where it says Sony PlayStation, but it's a Super Nintendo controller. I think that's really weird and cool at the same time. It almost looks like a knockoff. You gotta wonder, how are they thinking this is just a Super Nintendo with Sony plastered onto it? If we saw any games that would have came out for it, who knows what it would have been? Would it have been 32-bit? Who knows? I think that showed you what possibilities were there. First off, Sony was never in the video game industry back then. They didn't come out with the PlayStation until 1994. Seeing someone like Sony that made TVs and other types of hardware come in and be like, hey, we're doing video games now with Nintendo, it wouldn't have gotten as much bad reviews, because if we look at it now, people would think, oh, what's going on? Why is Sony making a console with Nintendo? No one even knew that Sony was even thinking about making video games. Seeing games that were PlayStation quality on a Nintendo console back in the early 90s, that would have been amazing. And it probably would have changed the gaming industry overall as we know it. We wouldn't have gotten a PlayStation. We wouldn't be at where we're at now, where PS5's coming out. Who knows? Even Microsoft might not have been able to come out with the Xbox. You would have never seen the war that's Sony versus Xbox all the time. It would have been Nintendo versus Microsoft. The auction also had this cartridge that just said 9210-6, which I'm assuming is the date where that one was built. So that could have just been software for developing the console, for developing any type of preliminary software that could have been for the console. We would have seen the Nintendo PlayStation, and that would have been one console from two companies. The gaming industry would have been completely different down the line. I mean, who knows? Sony could have still branched off and make their own console, but if they didn't, Nintendo would have been on top, if you understand what I mean. This console is said to be the last remaining prototype out of the 200 that were made. Most of the other consoles that we know of have either been destroyed or just not on the market or in somebody's basement. For a console like that to be sold for $360,000 is insane. All I know is seeing something like that in the gaming world be sold for such a high number, where the only other things you see that are sold for that high is like art pieces and exhibits. Like, you don't see a video game console sold for that much money, and it blows my mind. I was watching the auction live, and when it started at $280,000, I could not believe it. And then it went up to $300,000, but what you don't see is on the actual website, it says it was sold for $360K. That's not chump change. That's a lot of money. I find that fascinating. You know, I'm friends with the Game Chasers, and they have such a big understanding of how video game collecting works. And I've gone chasing with them in Texas and in Philly and in different places. And it's just so cool to see something like that be sold. I mean, none of us would even think about getting something for that much money unless we were all rich. For someone to grab that for $360,000 without thinking and just saying, this is gonna be mine, kudos to them. Like, I don't think anyone else would have thought that. You know, the three other people that would have bid for that, who did bid for that, I can only imagine who they are. And, you know, maybe we'll see who actually bought it. Maybe we'll see someone tweet about it or post it on Instagram or something. But I'm just happy something like that sold for that much. And the thing about it, the Nintendo PlayStation was only discovered and announced a couple years ago, where they first started realizing that there was some sort of dual branded console that was even in the works. The way I see it is, you see something that was a part of history that not too many people have, that you could call your own. And that's why I collect, because I see certain games and consoles and figures and other things that I couldn't get when I was younger, but I have the ability to get now. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people don't see the appeal to it. But to me, as a collector, I love that.
And those aren't the only things that were sold at the auction. Among other things, a copy of Pokemon Blue was sold for $3,600. Secret of Mana was sold for $10,000. Stadium Events was sold for $66,000. These numbers are crazy and just shows you how important collecting these things are to many, many people.
And of course, Little Samson for 18 grand. That game, if you ever go to a retro con or a lot where they're selling that, you will always see that game for over $2,000. And I have friends that own that game, and I guess the rarity of that cartridge is why it runs for that high. But for 18 grand, that's pretty crazy. When I first heard that Heritage was even auctioning off the Nintendo PlayStation, I thought, all right, that's going to be a crazy amount of money. But I did not think it was going to be for upwards of $300,000 or more. And this sold for even more. Seeing a console sold for that much is mind-blowing. Like, I don't know who would have thought that a video game console that never came out, that has no games for it, would sell for that much. But yeah, guys, if you liked what you saw, please give the video a like and let me know what you thought about this dead console selling for that much money. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.